Is it just, do I just say the differences that I found between the maps?
Yes, what do you see in the maps?
Okay, so
And what can that tell us about imperialism in Africa?
So for the first one, the black and white map, I said that there were many ethnic and linguistic groups throughout Africa at the time. And it was before like the European nations took over Africa. And then the map on the right, I said that it was after when the European had taken over Africa and it was divided, and Africa was divided among the countries, and many of the ethnic and linguistic groups were cut off.
Okay.
That's all I said.
Just a little comment to what Megan was saying. This is not the map. This is not the map of European borders fully, right? That is the one we saw before, this one, right? Where you still had French West Africa, the British part of Northern, Central, and South Africa, right? This is the map of modern political borders, right? So the countries as they exist today, right? Just to make that clear about the reading of the map. And what happens when, what do you think happens? And that is the second question in that point. What do you think happens when you have this much cultural diversity, we can call it, in Africa? And on top of that, you have these artificial lines that break out groups and put some other groups together that are not, let's say, that are not the same. When those differences are not respected, what do you think happens? Manolia, you raise your hand.
I was gonna say, like, are these maps showing like before the Europeans came and after? Because, like, aren't they both from 2019?
Yes, they're both modern maps. So, but the thing with the map on your left, that one doesn't have political borders. It just shows the names of the ethnic and linguistic groups as they are distributed around Africa. Right. Okay. That's why you have in the north, which is in the northern Africa, which is the big ethnic group.
Arabs.
Arabs, right. And then in the south of that, in what is the Saharan Africa, you have Bedouin, you have Berbers, and then in the sub-Saharan Africa, you have all of that part of the Golden Coast, what today is Mali, what today is Cote d'Ivoire, Ivory Coast, and so on. That is full of very different groups. So these are also modern groups. You're right. It's important to say that. But then what happens when you take these artificial lines and with those lines you start dividing and putting together, both dividing and putting together people that do not belong together in a way, let's say. That is, I'm thinking here with that question about, I'm thinking about this, right? What do these maps suggest about the consequences for African peoples of having Europeans determine the borders for African states? Ideas. Keenan raised his hand.
Okay.
Keenan.
So, well, when the Europeans separated the African ethnic groups, I could possibly see some miscommunication going on between two of the groups and conflict, because clearly it's like their land, and when they're pushed together, like they might not get along as well.
Right. Exactly. So that is one first idea. Thank you, Keenan. That can come from these maps as we see them, right? We may have something as the Europeans, starting even ethnic conflicts between these groups that existed, that exist, and that are the inhabitants of Africa outside of the European control. And also, as Keenan was saying, this can result in a series of conflicts, like the conflicts that, for example, Africa experienced during the 20th century, right? Okay, so that is where we finished last class. And for today, you were supposed to check the presentation and answer these 4 questions. So what we're going to do right now is I'm not going to go over the presentation myself, but I wanted to open the presentation. I'm going to divide you in 4 groups, 4 big groups. And in those groups, you're going to deal with one of the questions, right? You're going to check the presentation, do a little bit research online, and see how you can answer that question. We're going to have 5 minutes for that. Okay, 5 minutes. I'll divide you in groups, and in each of those groups, you're going to about the interest of European powers in Africa.
Okay, so they had multiple reasons, such as religious, political, economic, and exploratory reasons. But yeah, and then they also one of the reasons was to expand their territory and hopefully find and explore the new continent of Africa. Some economic reasons were to get some of Africa's precious metals and land, and then they also had cheap labor there, which is why they were also interested.
Good.
Oh, and while I was researching, I also found a poem called "The Brown Man's Burden."
Yes, I was planning on checking that later, because you remember the white man's burden.
Mm-hmm.
So this is an answer, actually.
Yes.
From also from an Englishman, but from the other side, from the other perspective. Good. Good. So Keenan already gave us some keys to answer question number 4. What about question number 5, Hatice?
Okay, so the question was, what was the Berlin Conference? How did it affect Europe's colonization of Africa? So we said the Berlin Conference took place during the 1884 and 1885, and it gave European nations the opportunity to take control over some parts of Africa and like divide the land between themselves. And it also allowed them to control the trade and colonization in Africa.
Good. This is the same conference. Thank you, Hatice. This is the same conference that we saw at the beginning, right? With the comic, not the comic, but the illustration of a German newspaper. And so we see that this was probably the main event where European powers came together in order to start tracing these lines, artificial lines, in the African continent. Good. Next question then, how did Europeans' view of the people of Africa impact how the colonies were governed? That was Megan, Mace, and Ali Aga. So I'm going to unmute you guys. So, Megan.
We couldn't really find an answer, but Ali said that the Europeans like were interested in Africa because they had like good resources, raw materials, but I don't really know how they made like impact the colonies that were governed.
Okay, it's fine. Mace, you want to add something?
Um, the Europeans were interested in like the three main factors: economic and political and social.
Mm-hmm.
They were motivated by these three factors.
And in the political, what did you find something about the political factor?